My name is Sid Meshkov. This is Sally Mencimer, and this is Elihu Abrahams. And we're here to talk about the good old days, and nobody knows more about them than Sally. So, Sally, would you like to start?
All right. My reign encompassed 4 decades, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And so I thought today I would talk about the 60s, the early 60s. And that would be the period of time when we were at the physics division of the Aspen Institute. So I will talk about more about our relationship with the Institute until our mutual divorce in 67 or 68. I'm not sure on that year when we then became the Aspen Center for Physics. And I would like to talk about Stranahan was the only building, and kind of physically how the town was and how the center, the physics center fit in with the town and that period of time. In the spring of 1964, I was teaching high school English, and I heard by word of mouth that they were looking for a secretary at the physics division of the Aspen Institute. And I was probably like 90% of the rest of the 1,000 people in Aspen. They had heard of the Aspen Institute but did not know a single thing about the physics division, did not know there was a building that had been built 2 years previously, did not know where it was located or anything. But I went out to the Institute, and having the confidence that I had in those days, assumed that I would get the job as secretary for which I was applying. And I don't even know if anybody else even had applied for the job. The 2 secretaries before me, the first year, was Marcy Balderson. It might be interesting to talk to her about the very first year. And from her, I inherited 6 little cribs that a baby under 20 pounds could sleep in, but no one coming with a 2 or 3 or 1-year-old could use. And I think we're still using those for the newborns. And the second year was Betsy Baldwin, and she was the second secretary. And from her, I inherited the idea that every single widowed and separated man would be able to date the secretary at the Center for Physics. But she was.
Who interviewed you for this job?
Well, Lynn Lane did the interviewing out at the Institute, and the job was to be a summer job for 3 months. That was the only paid employee because the Institute did everything else. It did the cleaning and the maintenance and paid the utilities, and they did the payroll. We really had just the one employee. And so I went out for the interview. I was to be paid $1,000 for the summer, but the job actually was like 6 months, April through September. But that was a lot of money because I was making $4,000 a year teaching school. So I, of course, said I would love it. They said they would love it. And I remember meeting Bob Craig, who was the executive director of the Aspen Institute, and being so impressed at the time because his picture had just been on Life magazine as one of 100 top young executives in the country. There was it was a collage of 100 top people, and Bob was one of them and really fit in. And great guy right from the very beginning, and of course did so much to help this get underway. So my very first job, well, then I think I'd like to talk about the Stranahan Hall and what
Sure.
it looked like, because I had no idea where the physics building was. This was way out of town. 6th Street was completely out of town.
Nice.
Nobody came out this way.
So the West End was not the prestigious West End.
There were no buildings here at all. It was a great big field. And Stranahan sat in this field. There were no trees around it. We had the row of cottonwoods. Of course, no parking lot, no sidewalks or anything. And there was a farmhouse right here where Hoosier Hall is. And it was being rented by a young couple, and they had a horse corral and had horses. And they could go on down to the racetrack and with their horses. And here was this low concrete building in a field of flowers, and that's what it was. And we had no vegetation or landscaping or trees around it. And a man by the name of Richard Farrell, do you know him?
Sure.
He donated about 25 trees. And the very first, he was one of the very first people to come. And he donated 25 trees, and they were planted around Stranahan Hall. Also, it was not called Stranahan Hall in those days. It was the physics building. It wasn't named Stranahan Hall until later down the road when we started naming things. And Richard came maybe the first couple years, and then didn't come for about 25 or 30 years.
He was at the University of Maryland.
Yes. And about 25 or 30 years later, he came, and here were these gorgeous trees had grown up all around this concrete box. And so we were so delighted. And that also kind of symbolizes kind of the very beginning and what has come through, that people kept donating and giving of themselves, giving of their time, their money, planting trees, I mean, that sort of thing. And that's why I always felt that it always worked. But when we came to Stranahan, it had just it had a front door. It had no other doors. It didn't even have a back door. It didn't have the patio. It had the 10 offices and the 2 bathrooms, did not have a utility sink, had no storage, had no library. I mean, it was just this concrete building with 10 offices. They had spent quite a bit of money on carpeting, and some of the offices still have that original carpeting, which is 40 years later. But so I saw the building and realized what I was getting into, and there would be 20 people here at a time.
Excuse me, was the front lobby the way it is
The
now?
front lobby was where it was, and the coffee room in the back, that was the seminar room.
Yeah.
But there was no door back there for the patio. Now, that came later. And so the secretary would sit in the front, and there was one phone. And the other thing, I always felt that,
I remember the one.
yeah, the one phone, and of course no paging. So if the phone rang, I would answer it, and then I would yell, and they'd have to come to the one phone to answer it. And so I always felt that the Center for Physics was also a kind of a history of communication, because we go from the one phone through the mimeograph machines and to the email and. How would you describe your system now?
A vaguely competent communication.
But so the very first project that I had to do was to find housing, and which it continues to be, I think, one of the most difficult parts of the job. And Aspen, as I said, had about 1,000 people. It had no condominiums in those days, no apartment buildings. It has some of the old Victorians. They were just beginning to pave the streets. There were like 2 blocks of paved streets on Main Street, and they were starting to pave. And so how do you find housing? Because it was even difficult to find housing for people who were living and working here. And I lived in a little Victorian on Lake Avenue, which is on Hallam Lake. We call it a shotgun house because you shoot a gun through the front door and it would go out the back door, these little narrow Victorian houses. So Jerry Huey, longtime Aspenite, was working at the Aspen Meadows, because the Aspen Meadows was also part of the Aspen Institute. And he had started, I guess he had done the housing the first 2 years, and he had started to get the housing. So he took me around to show me what he had gotten. And the one place I remember was something called the Paintbrush, and it was behind the Aspen Clinic, and it was about 6 tiny little, almost like a motel room, but it had a tiny little kitchen in it. And he had rented these 6 to 8 little places, and they were just awful, just awful. And we were putting families into them, and they were going to live here. And so I think we had them the first year because we inherited them the first year, but we never had them after that. And the average that we were paying for places was $60 to $70, $80, $90 a month for these places. And we did not have the property management places either. So it was very difficult to find housing, but we started to scrounge around, and we did find the little Victorians is what we started to rent.
Things like Kettle Camp and...
Well, Kettle Camp and Vogenthaler was the first place you lived in, was a Vogenthaler. And we'd take a larger Victorian house and put the bachelors in them. We did 4 or 5 bedroom house, and then we put the single men into the housing. But at the time, I think we were having like 20 people each week. So it meant that we had to rent about 20 places. But so that was the beginning of trying to find the housing and for the people coming in. We had no setup for any cleaning in those days or maid service or linens. We rented the houses, the people came into the houses, and they were to clean them and leave, and then the next one would come in, and it worked. We had, as I say, so few people that it seemed to work. And I can remember, so then we get the housing set up, and the center's going to start the 1st of June or whenever it began. Now, George Stranahan, of course, was the president, and Mike Cohen was the treasurer. He wasn't really a treasurer, and we didn't even have a president because we were again running out of the Aspen Institute. But George came and was starting to get us set up, and we had the people arriving. And I remember the very first man to arrive. His name was Alex Stewart, and he came with his little boy, red-headed boy, and this boy now would probably be 40-some years old. And we put him into these little paintbrush studios with a tiny crib and this tiny apartment, and it was just awful. But he was very nice and very gracious, and I think he came back for a few years after that. So then we started in with our summer, and of course we still have some of the originals. And unfortunately, I'm not that good about the names. I know Kaus was original, and Norton was one of the originals, and Mike Harrison, and the people started to come every 2 or 3 weeks, and we'd have the changeover, and I think things went quite simply. And the Aspen Institute, we used their library, we used their mimeograph machines. That was before we had any kind of copy services or copying or anything. When we made, and they wanted copies of everything I was typing, so I'd have to put in, carbon paper, and I was not a good typist. I had 8th grade typing, but we kept copies of everything, and the secretary was supposed to be answering the phone and taking care of the housing and typing all the papers and doing the mail, and it was simply a secretarial job. And then they would go over to the Institute to use the library and had the mailings.
But they didn't have any technical material in the Institute library.
No, they had no technical. But, and I got thinking about that because we started the journals right from the beginning.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how did the library get started?
And so I think the journals were kept over there in the beginning.
How did we get the journals? Did people contribute them, or
no,
did we subscribe?
We started to subscribe.
Okay.
And that goes back to '62. And so the journals came, but they came over there, and they were even stored over there. Okay. And I don't think we had a textbook library as such. I mean, but we did start with the journals, but they were kept over there in their library. And and then we had the seminar room was for the seminars, and we had really no campus as such. So one of the very first projects was probably the next year that we knocked out the wall.
That would have been what, 65?
In 65, and we built the patio.
Okay.
And we knocked out that back wall because there wasn't even a back door. And Stan Belmer came and they laid out the patio. It is just the way it was now. But I remember that they were pouring the cement, and Bill was working on a cement crew at the time, and a mason working for a mason, and it was during a Sunday concert, and they had the mixer going beep 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 beep, and the guy comes running over from the tent, turn off the mixer, and so the music and physics was, I guess we were at arms right from the beginning, because they were trying to get this back patio poured and laid out. But and the patio had the cement floor and then the walls, but had no landscaping and had no cover, so it was just out in the open. And I don't even think in the very beginning we had a blackboard. Of course, we finally had to get some kind of a portable blackboard to be out there. But that was one of the very beginning things. So then, from then, we did start to landscape a little bit so that they could sit out and be outside, because the physicists always wanted to be outdoors right from the beginning. And we had the picnics from the very first, but we didn't have them on campus. We would go out into the wilderness once a week, and we would go to Difficult Creek, and we'd go to Lincoln Creek, and we'd go to Snowmass Creek, and we'd go up to the Bells and Maroon Bells and the different campgrounds, and I think it seems to me, I felt in a way that was almost more single men than families in the beginning. Now would it maybe be a 10th or a 20th and that all, but I thought it was more. But we did have the families, and everybody would pack his own individual picnic, and we'd get in the cars and go up to these different campgrounds, and we didn't have to reserve them or do anything. We would just put a note on the door and go. And I can remember being up Lincoln Creek, and Feynman was like the Pied Piper, taking a horde of kids around the racetrack up Lincoln Creek, running backwards with the kids chasing after him, and putting himself on every level. And the picnics were a good groundbreaker and a good way for the families all to get together and meet each other. So I guess that's really kind of the very beginning part of it that I remember. Should I start to go now from after when we got away from the Institute? The next stage...
Yeah, why did we split from the Institute? Do you remember that?
I'm not going to remember the politics of it. I think I probably, and also in the very beginning, we had almost no financing. We did not have the NSF grant. Of course, NASA, the astrophysics funding came quite a bit later. And so we were running on this very low registration fee, which I think was $20 or $30. And the Need More Foundation, which was George Stranahan's foundation. But so we had a very low budget. I mean, we had my secretarial fee of $3,000, and the utilities for the buildings and the journals and all. And I think they just felt that we should. So we were really on the shirt sleeves of the Institute, and I think they felt that we should come on our own, and we felt that we should come on our own. But I think the period in between there, before that happened, was the building of Hilbert Hall. So probably that would be the next transition.
Yeah, my first year here was 1968, and that was when Hilbert Hall was already built.
Because it was built in '67.
Yeah, and they had the big Fermi Lab planning.
Yes.
It was then called National Accelerator Lab planning.
And again, it was built in '67, and that happened very rapidly. But I think the period also that would happen in there that we did get our own finance. We got this National Science Foundation money. The other thing what I was told and why the center worked right from the beginning on this with one building in this low budget and the people coming and people wanting to come was because it was recognized as such a place that the physicists could come here and get their summer salaries. And that was one of the key points that made it work. So they could come here and be paid, because we were never paying them or never giving them any money. But because they could get their summer salary, they could come here and work. And so that's how it caught on. So I always thought that was one of the key elements of it taking off and working. The other element that I was given to believe was Hans Beda's endorsing it right from the beginning and encouraging. And he was one of the very first ones to come, and Fine was one of the first ones to come. And
Murray.
I'd be interested to know when Murray came, because I really thought he was later.
Well, I first came in '66, I think, and I think Murray was already coming.
Okay, I don't, for
But,
some reason, so I never felt the early.
But you're right, there was a lot of personality endorsing
Yes.
the center, which made it popular.
But I think the Institute, I never felt that we had a really close working with the Institute, and I don't think the Institute ever really cared that much that we were here or not, and in a way maybe we were a burden to them. But the next stage, I think, really was the building. We got the NSF grant, and then the building of Hilbert Hall. And I think Hilbert Hall was named Hilbert Hall right from the beginning, and that George named it Hilbert Hall. But again, that was an endorsement or wanting, because Fermilab, the National Accelerator, NAL, wanted to come here and do the planning, and they were here for 2 years. So they paid for the building to be built. And that building went up in 2 to 3 months. And of course, it had no insulation, again, had 2 toilets. It did have electricity. I have to admit, it had electricity, but that was about all it had. I mean, it was a floor, walls, and a roof, and 2 toilets, and that was it. And it was built in these modulars. The irrigation was coming through the back, and I thought it was kind of neat how they built the building around the irrigation and not so that it wasn't affecting the irrigation. And in the early years, the irrigation came across the front and where the farmhouse was. In about a year or so, I wanted to talk about moving the farmhouse, because the first 2 or 3 years we had the farmhouse. And then it was moved literally by Bruce and Nancy Blakesley over to 4th and Smuggler. And it became, they attached it to their house. And Nancy ran a little kiddies program out of this little farmhouse. And that building now is Bill Sterling's house. And they've owned that house for quite a long time. But they took this one little farmhouse and they moved the building and moved it about 3 blocks away. So then we were starting to open up even more. And I think we were starting to capture some of the meadow and starting to have some of the yard. And so then when we had Hilbert, and when we built Hilbert, the electricity from Hilbert was literally a line coming through the irrigation ditch and hooking into the electricity of Stranahan. Nice. So I mean, because there were no poles or power or anything. We were also on septic tanks,
yeah.
and for all those years.
I remember having a discussion at the Coral Gables conference once, where we went to some Cuban restaurant in Miami, and what are we doing? We're discussing the septic tank problem for Aspen.
Well, and we had no heat.
Right.
That's what Hilbert had. It had no heat, so it had a line going through the irrigation ditch to Stranahan, and that was the only utility. So NAL, National Accelerator Lab, came out for those 2 years, and I'm going to go back to calling it Hilbert Hall,
sure,
because that's how we finally knew it. And it had 40 offices, and for those first 2 years, they really did use it, and they kind of ran their business separately from us. Except I think I did have to get their housing. I had to find their housing. But they were moving their people in and out.
Well, how many weeks did they use Hilbert?
They used it the whole summer.
The whole summer?
They used it at least 9 to 10 weeks of it. I don't think it was 12. But they were using it the whole summer, and they weren't using it. Didn't use all of it, and there was an environmental group used one wing of it. Dana Orwick, and he was with the Aspen Institute, and it was an environmental group, so it was very early, and those people went on, that group, and I don't remember the name of it, but it was a early environmental, and Wayne Kuntz and different people came and they used one wing of it. And I don't think that they were even giving us rent. I know they weren't giving us rent. And of course, in those days, we really were still part of the Institute. So it was kind of like the Institute using one section of that building even though we were a division of the Aspen Institute, we never were financed by them. They did not give us any money for any of our buildings or to run our utilities or anything. They did, as I said, they did the cleaning and the maintenance, and they ran the payroll ran through them, but they didn't give us money for the buildings. But then they used that one wing. It was the center wing of Hilbert those first couple years. So it was in that period of time then we talked about making the break from the Institute. And it was a very amiable break. We simply became a nonprofit corporation. And then we were out from under them completely. By that time, we built a library in Stranahan. And Bill did that. There was a kind of a storeroom in the northwest corner, and Bill went in and made shelves all the way around that, and that became the first library. And so then, when we made the break from the Institute, we brought all those journals and everything over and got them set up in that library. And by then we were starting to get textbooks, and I think people were donating, and obviously we had a small budget for books. It wasn't much of a budget, but we were starting to get some books. But it was clear that the library was probably one of the most important elements of the entire center, right from the very beginning. So
yeah, you can come here and work.
Yeah. And so the NAL had used Hilbert for those 2 years of '67 and '68.
So we were still only 20 people
at
that time.
Yeah, at that time.
But then we suddenly went up.
And then we went up to 60 people because we had the use of
Hilbert.
Of Hilbert Hall.
Well, how did you suddenly triple the housing?
It was a miracle.
Well, I suppose in the late 60s we were starting to get some things were starting to be built. The Berghoff apartment condominium, you're starting to get some condominiums being built. But again, we really people were renting their houses. Yeah. And because it was a ski place, people were here more, that was more winter oriented, and people were here for the winter and not for the summer as such. So I don't really, we just seem to keep finding the places. One of the very first things I did, and again, this was in the 60s, I think, I tried to put together a consortium, and this is before we had the ballet, before the dance. but with the music and the institute and the physics, so that we were not competing with each other and on the prices. And the prices hadn't taken off yet in those days. So there was kind of the institute, and the institute was not renting many places. They had the meadows, and they were using their places. But the music students were coming in and finding rooms with people, and people were taking them into their housing, so they weren't competing as much. So in the early days, I always claimed, and the people claimed, that we were the largest, one of the largest industries, because we were the largest renters of property, and they said, the post office said we had the greatest volume, and the music people said we bought the most tickets, and the library said we had a library, of course, on Main Street, and Aspen always had a nice library, and we were the greatest users of the library. So we were a very important part of the economy in the 60s. So we then we were having to find more and more places, and by then I think we were starting to get some property management places, but we didn't use them to manage the properties. I was able to keep the prices low because I said, you rent to me for the 3 months and I'll manage the properties. And that's where we got in, unfortunately, got into the property management business. And that got way out of hand and became such an incredible job, because then we were hiring our own maids, and we were doing our own laundry, and we had our own washer and dryer, and doing it. But that kind of came in when we did Beta. So I guess the next progression is Beta. So what year was Beta built?
74, something like that.
remember.
I'm not sure, but I think around 74, 75.
So I think everything was fairly static, maybe the first 10 years, the way I'm describing it. We had 60 participants. People were clamoring to come here. We then, because of the clamoring to come, we then had to start to have the selection committees, deciding who was coming. Another huge job was deciding people would apply, and then we really kind of controlled who came by the housing. I'd find the 20 or 30 or 40 places, because we were doubling up with the bachelors, so I think we were doing 30 or 40 places, and I'd rent those the 3 months, and then we would start to fit them into the housing, into the places, and that was how they came.
I think in 74 I was secretary. I remember having these spreadsheets with 4-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom.
Yeah, and that's how we came, and we were able to get 1-bedroom places, but as the years went on, they ceased to exist. But so whoever was the secretary and the person, we'd be fitting these people in, and then the people would start to come and go. And we had the sheets barely got off the bed, and the pillows were still warm when the next people would come in. So it was an honor system where they were just supposed to be taking care of their own places and leaving, and the place would be clean, and then the next ones came in, and unfortunately that system broke down completely.
I remember the cleaning, the frenzy of cleaning the apartments as you're about to leave.
Yeah, they're going out the door, and the next people are standing there waiting to come in. We were able to find places, and the rents, they started to go up. Where we were paying $100 a month, they started to go up to be $200 and $300 a month, and the prices were, and we were charging the people probably about half of that, or we always were supplementing the housing in some way, and that's when we put in that dislocation system, and that was supposed to supplement the housing.
What was let me ask, because I don't remember, was the system of having the youngest, least affluent participants get the biggest rebates
Yes.
started at the very beginning?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, that always did happen. And also on the selection committee, I think that really it was kind of the secretary, and he maybe had a small committee. It wasn't the big way it is now
No.
for it.
There were
We
like
used to have
four.
maybe 4 or 5 people.
4 or 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, the secretary, the president, and a
'Cause
couple other
I remember
people.
we had a few of those meetings at Rockefeller in the
Yeah.
70s, and it was about 4 or 5 people.
Yeah.
And twice as many would apply as we could fit in. I mean,
Right.
uh,
Do you remember when people from Europe started to come, or any personalities from Europe?
Right from the very beginning, we had them coming from Europe, and we had one Russian came in the 60s from Russia, and he was here, he wasn't sponsored. We didn't do the National Academy of Sciences. I mean, he was here and able to stay, he was in Stranahan, and I'm in the front lobby, and he kept going past me. He kept walking past me, and I kept thinking, well, and he was climbing out the window and then walking past him. He wanted some kind of communication. And he was a neat guy. He barely spoke English. And about 25 years later, he came back.
Who was it? Do you remember?
Well, I want to say, no, I'm not. I'd have to look at the early rosters. It was, and he was able to come back and because I thought when he left, I'll never see him again. But we did have them. The early participation from Europe right from the beginning. But we weren't helping them. We weren't helping anybody financially. They were having to get here, and we weren't giving them any money, but they were clamoring to come. I mean, the reputation was such right from the beginning that this was the place to be, and all. So very informal. We didn't even have, we had maybe 1 or 2 seminars a week. And it was kept that way intentionally, and so they had an office, and they were starting to set up that, so we had kind of an outside, and it worked because they just came and started talking to each other, and
I have a question. When did the workshop start? Do you remember?
probably not until the 70s,
Yeah,
into the
after
70s.
75.
Yeah. And now the astrophysics came in like 68. Wasn't that the beginning of the astrophysics?
They always came early in the summer.
Yeah,
I
they
know.
always had a workshop.
They had a
As soon as they
workshop,
started, they had a workshop.
and then they brought in their own money. They brought in some NASA money, and so they were taking care of themselves. And also, but I think it really was about 68 that they came, and they were kind of working themselves individually and separately too. They were kind of a separate group and all, and they came the first 3 weeks of the summer. So that was kind of a beginning of a workshop type of idea and feeling, and they took over about half of the place at the time. So if we were running 60 people, they were running 30. When we got up to 80 people, they were running 40. And I always felt there wasn't a real lot of meshing or intermingling, but that kind of came later on. I felt that there was more of but that they were kind of being separated in the beginning, and they had their own group and their own money and their own acceptances and all. But then they they intermingled and started to mesh, and it worked. And I always thought that they were a really good asset or a good beginning to that they helped. I mean, that was a part that worked and came in. I guess I could talk a little bit about when the sessions were exactly the 3 months, and then we literally closed down Hilbert Hall. We drained the water and the snow.
Put the bikes in.
And put the bikes in, and the snow piled up around it, and the fox had their babies underneath it, and we in the very early years we drained Stranahan, and Stranahan was closed up also, and nothing, nothing came in, and the mail, we were continuing getting the journals and everything, and I'd go to the library and I'd collect that stuff and have it at home because this was all snowbound. It was snowbound here and everything, and all for the first few years. Then you mentioned the bicycles, and that started really right from I think I started that right in the very beginning. And I don't remember how I started it, but that I did go out and start to get a few used bicycles, and it caught on. And Bill built some bike racks, and we didn't have locks or anything, and we just started collecting bikes, and of course they loved it so that then we had to do a bike system, but I just started going out and buying used bikes.
Because you bought one of George's bikes when he was a little kid.
Because most people did not come with cars. Again, in those days, we didn't have car rental places. We didn't. There wasn't a way of renting a car and driving up here. The airport was somewhat primitive, and so people would get here, and then they'd have no means of transportation. So we got going with the bikes right from the very beginning, and that worked, and was one of the good ideas. But so I guess that kind of covers the 60s.
When did Terry Ann start the?
That's again into the 70s too. Also. Frank Smotherman was and I think he was the late 60s, and he had a children's play school thing, preschool, and in the 60s, and I think we rented him Stranahan, one part of Stranahan for $100 a month or something like that, because we didn't have preschools. There was one preschool in town. Patsy Forbes had a preschool. And Frank was then being the competition and was going to be a preschool also. And the Physics Center felt that this was a way of contributing to the community because there was a need for this. And but Frank Smotherman was the first, and he had a little play school and had half a dozen kids or something. And he had that for 2 or 3 years. And then I think he moved down Valley. And then Terry came and filled in the gap with the Montessori school. And again, we took her on trying to fill in this gap for the preschool. And so she had the Montessori for like 20 years. And in fact, it'd probably be interesting to talk to her and get remembering her thing. But I'll tell you the year. In 1970, the community school had their first school in Hilbert Hall.
That's George's school.
And that was George's school, and it was in 1970. So that's when we started to winterize, and they were starting this school. It was a group of parents, and they wanted a different philosophy of education, and so they came in to Hilbert. The parents did. They tore out partition walls out of, I think we only used 2 wings of it, but they took out all of the partition walls for offices, and they came in with some insulating. They came in with some heating. Hilbert was kind of up almost on
Right,
stilts,
right.
and so they
Yeah, there was
put
crawl space underneath.
it wasn't even crawl space, but they came in and put in kind of some furnaces down underneath and some real Rube Goldberg heating, forced air heating
Yeah, I
thing
remember this.
to have the school. And the reason I remember is that Jay was in the first, my son Jay was in the first kindergarten class, and he was 4 years old, going to be 5. So it was in 1970, and so it'd be 71 because he would be 5 in
Okay.
September of 71. He was 4. And he remembers a sandbox on wheels, and it was a great big, huge sandbox, and they would wheel this around.
This was inside.
And it was inside, and Harry Teague's wife, Annie Teague, was his kindergarten teacher.
That's great.
And so they started the school, and they had this teacher from New Zealand, Sylvia Ashton Warner, was the teacher. And she came and they were trying to do her philosophy of education with this community school, which had a few teachers and the parents pitching in and doing so much. And as a parent, I remember, and because she was like a teaching, they got money by having teachers come from all over the country, supposedly observing the school and learning under her because she was such a well-known teacher. And so part of my tuition for paying for Jay to teach was to board these teachers who were coming in to learn under this system. And of course, it was a very open system. And it was kindergarten through 8th grade.
Nice. Okay.
And so that was an early beginning of Hilbert Hall. And the community school was there, I think, for 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
Until they built their own building, which I'm not sure when they built their own building. So they would have to come and take the walls out every year and then put the walls back in every spring to have the school.
Oh, so that's where we first got heat in Hilbert.
And it got heat in Hilbert. And it was that heat system was the system we used right to the end. And because they were only using the 2 wings, the one wing didn't have any heat at all. And so Bill and myself, and I'll tell you what year that was. Anyways, the 2 of us completely insulated and sheetrocked Hilbert by ourselves one winter. Just the 2 of us. And then we put electric heat into the one wing of Hilbert Hall because it didn't have heat. But we spent that, and he put up scaffolding, and we're literally the 2 of us insulating and sheetrocking that whole building and all those offices. And that would have been in the 70s,
Yeah.
sometime in the 70s. So, but even after we had heat in there and the community school was gone and it was insulated, we still drained it and did not use it in the winters. We never did use that in the winters at all. But the next big phase we did with Hilbert was to take 4 of the offices from the main wing and turned that into a library. And he did that. He tore out the 4 offices and built the library shelves and
That was in the center wing.
center wing. And we got lighting in there, and we moved the library. And that was a big project of moving the library. By this time, the Durans had come on, and that's when we had lots and lots of work parties.
Oh, I remember.
Volunteer work parties. And we would buy beer, and we'd buy pizza, and we would twist arms and get everybody to help. So we had to, one of the work parties was moving the library from Stranahan to the new library. And the physicists themselves literally carried the books and shelved the books. And I think Bernice was really like the very first library committee and organizing the library.
That's when the books all got labeled with yellow and red rectangles and circles.
And well, that I think actually came later too.
Oh,
I think that
later?
came when we got going with Beta.
Oh, okay.
And but we physically moved all the journals, and we filled up this. Well, we probably, it was 4 times the space, and moved in, and we had pretty good light in there, and we put some tables in there, and it was a pretty decent library. And I think we added that back door to it. And also we were adding doors to Stranahan, because Stranahan had the front door period, and well, we had added the back door for the patio, and then we kicked out the end offices and put doors into Stranahan.
When did the staff expand past just having one secretary?
Not for a few years.
No, but in '66 already, Joan Pomeroy was diagnosing my broken ankle.
So I think we had I remember I moved from the front desk back to the office behind, and I was in that office with George. And so we did have another, like a receptionist secretary, but we still were had the one phone.
Yeah, one phone.
And it was in '67 or in '68 that we started to, Hilbert was here, but it was being used, so we took what we called annexes. And we rented big houses near the center and had annexes. And I know it was either '67 or '68 that we rented the Marquand studio, which was right down on Lake Avenue. And I don't know how we all functioned that year, because George and myself and David Pine, we all moved down to the Marquand studio, and it was like we abandoned Stranahan. The NAL was running Hilbert, and we all went down there and had our little enclave of nucleus of the people who were supposedly running the thing down there, and we were biking back and forth up here, and I had a secretary up here answering the phones and doing the typing, and I remember that I had this one office in a master bedroom of the Marquand studio, and Bobby Kennedy rented the Marquand studio right after us, and it had this great big huge picture over the bed, and the picture fell off onto the bed. We all were laughing, thanking heavens that it wasn't Ethel and Bobby in the bed, when this picture came down on us. But so we made offices in bedrooms and the kitchens and the dining rooms, and that was a pretty large building. And we had upstairs, I put 2 or 3 bachelors into the upstairs bedrooms, and then we would come in and take over, and we were running it as an office downstairs, and then we had bachelors living upstairs, and this one guy lived upstairs, Eric Weissman, and we never saw him, and we wondered if where he was or what he was doing, but he was holing out in his bedroom upstairs. But so we did that for a couple of years, and it was. I said in those days that our hearts were young and gay, and that was when you could use
the word gay.
happily use the word gay, and we were all young. We were all in our 20s, and it was George and Mike and myself, and we just had not a care in the world, and we were on top of the world and thought we could do anything and accomplish anything, and
you did.
And we just had such a good happy time, so then we had like the one secretary, and then so then when we took over Hilbert, Then we started to have like 2 secretaries, and by that time, again, with doing your history of communications, we had a mimeograph machine. The old purple ink thing, and that I think we inherited that from the Fermi Lab, from the national, that they came out with a mimeograph machine. And I started writing something called Physical Review E.
Right, I remember.
And why I did this, except I guess I was always a frustrated journalist, but I was coming out with a weekly newspaper.
Right.
And then I did that for about 2 or 3 years. And of course, you're trying to do the housing, type the papers, answer the phone, and then I'm bringing this newspaper I'm interviewing people, and I was bringing out these 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-page newspapers that we were running off on the purple ink mimeograph
We have
machines.
those.
They should be in the archives.
The trouble is that it fades.
But,
That blue stuff fades.
I mean, we were.
Now there's a real physical review E.
I heard that. Yes, I heard that. I did know that.
But we have the copyright.
Yeah, and I mean, we were drawing pictures, and people were contributing articles. Pete Carruthers was giving fishing manuals,
Right.
and you were giving eating manuals, and I was interviewing people. I started interviewing wives. Trying to bring them in, and we'd have a list of current events and activities to do, and answering all the questions and everything, but that was the time of mimeographing. But again, we were typing papers.
That was a big chore.
But I think we really, right from the beginning, kind of told these guys they had to send their papers back and get them typed.
Yeah.
And David Pines didn't, but everybody else did.
But you're also typing letters and
Right.
and technical letters as well.
Yeah, and because I remember when we started to do the typing, I would type, and again with these carbons, and I'd leave spaces for the formulas.
Right.
And so, because we didn't have a ball or anything for
Right,
typing,
right.
so I'd type all the stuff and I'd leave a space, and then I'd type all the stuff and I'd leave a space, and then the guy would go and fill in the formulas, and of course do the correcting of them. And so there was some typing and organizing. And we were at the picnics, but I think we also started doing, cocktail parties in the beginning, again, when Fermilab was here. I think they had a great big reception, or started to do receptions and everything, and so we started to do these cocktail parties. And so that was in the 60s also,
It was kind of fun when the patio parties,
Yeah,
when we all brought stuff.
Everybody brought, and Betsy Stranahan would come in with platters and platters of corned beef and meats, and she was doing the majority of the food, and then a few other people would come in with some mushrooms.
Well, we always used to wait for the fishermen to come.
Oh yeah, fishermen to come in with the full bar, and I think we always did do them on the patio.
Yeah.
We did.
The cocktail parties, and then. At the beginning with the patio, we had kind of a trellis mechanism that supposedly the theory was that vines were supposed to come up and over and cover, and the trellis collapsed probably 2 to 3 times, and Bill would rebuild the trellis. And I remember we would take the wood home and use the wood for our heat for all winter because from these trellises. And finally, we got into using the canvas.
That was what? That was in the 70s, or?
No, the canvas?
Canvas, even
80s.
more in the
80s,
80s, more into the 80s. Because so we had this kind of trellis over the patio, and we got those chairs, those chairs right from the beginning, and we probably even had some of those chairs in the seminar room in Stranahan in the beginning, and then we added to those. But the cocktail parties were fun, and I remember by that time we started to have the Russian program. That was in the 70s. The Russian program started with the academy, and the 70s or early 80s, because the one story I remember was. Phil Anderson had rented a little Volkswagen Beetle. And so the Russian program, we were bringing in 5 or 6, well, it got up to 14, 15, 20 Russians, but in the beginning it was 6 to 10 Russians. And the Russians came to these cocktail parties, and they were mixing, they had never seen alcohol in this abundance before, and they were mixing god-awful orange juice and Crown Royal, and I mean, they were just, getting very, very high. And so the party would end, and Phil piled in a bunch of the Russians into the little Beetle. He had about 4 or 5 Russians in, and everybody's 3 sheets to the wind, and driving off in the Beetle thing, and they had a KGB guy with each contingency.
Right.
So he jumps, he was the only sober one in the group, and he jumps on his bicycle, and he's on his bicycle running, running after the Phil and the Volkswagen, trying to follow where he's taking all the Russians. But those parties were a lot of marriages came and went with those parties. I mean, it was they were powerful parties, I have to admit. Again, as I say, our hearts were young and gay, and we were living it to the fullest.
I remember one time a collection of Russians came. We met them at the airport, and we immediately took them to lunch at the Motherlode. And some of these guys had been in the U.S., but some had never been in the U.S., and they were transported from Russia directly to Aspen. I mean, that was a pretty hefty and heady change.
Yeah, it really was, and that happened a lot. And I remember picking up one and taking him out to the airport, and here are all the private jets. This is probably getting more into the 80s, and those are all private planes. And he says, "Yes, we have that also," or something. Everything we had, they had, but it had to be a real cultural shock. And I don't know what the status of the Russian program now, but we had it right to when I
I don't think there's a separate program.
retired.
There hasn't been for years.
And I remember. Just about the end when I was leaving, talking to one who had been here several times and trying to talk to him about Russia, and he said, "I can't talk about it." He says, "It's just so hopeless." But we had a period in there where we were really getting the top Russians, Polyakov and McDowell and I remember Bill and I went to a party at the Alpenblick in Fasching House. And we were the only Americans there. There was all Russian and a couple from South America and Chris Pethick from England, and then Bill and myself. And we got telling jokes, and there was no language barrier telling dirty jokes. I guess it's a universal language, but Sasha McDowell gets up on this balcony of the Fasching House and dives into the.
So you actually saw that? I've only heard about it.
Into this pool, and he could have been splattered. I mean, you were bringing it in, and we were liable for the care and everything of him diving into this pool. I guess it was overwhelming, but he
was
survived.
reprimanded later by the authorities for doing that by their KGB guy alongside.
And towards the end, I guess the KGB didn't come, but they certainly were there in the beginning. But then I guess we get into the period of Beta Hall.
Yeah.
And,
do you want to say something about how that happened?
Again, our popularity had just expanded. I mean, we're running now like 60 people, and we were probably even running. We probably went from 60 to 70 and 80, really even before we had Beta, because we were having those annex buildings because people wanted to come.
But even after Beta, we continued the annexing. That's true,
right? That was the maximal.
Well, we used the Farney House, and we used the Langdon Camp. We used these other houses.
My first year, I had an office on 6th Street.
That was the Langdon Camp House, which is right there, And so it was clear that we needed more space, and the library was continuing to expand.
And we needed an indoor seminar room.
And so it was agreed that we could raise the money and get the money and build Beta. And that Beta was built for, Hilbert was built for like 30,000, 20 or 30,000, and Beta came in like at 70 or 80,000. I mean, it came in so, we went ahead and got a mortgage. And again, going back to the volunteerism, I mean, the center worked because you fellows and ladies all pitched in and wanted it to work. And so about 5 or 6 people went down to the bank and co-signed a note on their own individual credit. And we got a loan.
What I remember that was that a whole bunch of us signed some promissory note. My recollection was it was to George, that George took out a big loan and that we promised George that we would repay him on that big loan. I may be wrong on the details of it,
well,
but I know that we all
signed
kind of put our money where our mouths was.
Right. But of course, by this time, you've become this separate nonprofit corporation, and it was being run by just a few people, probably the first 20, 25 years. But then you saw the need to form a board and take on an organization, become an organization. So that started to evolve when you became a board. You became a board of trustees. And then from that you went on into general members, and then from that you went on into committees, and so then when you had your committees, then it became this bigger organization.
Well, it's now a much more formal structure.
Yeah, but it was very informal, probably the first 25 years, just run by a few people, and without a whole lot of hassle, even to the president, because I really was kind of running the mechanics of it, and then with the board really running the educational or the scientific aspect of it. And again, we had volunteer work parties, and one of the other stories with Hilbert Hall, R.R. Wilson was president of Fermilab, or National Accelerator Lab at the time, and he was an artist, and so he had had some sculptures in the front, and George had his fingers into all kinds of different things, and there was an artist colony over near the end of 7th Street, and in a barn over there, and they were doing these huge sculptures. So they finished up these sculptures, and between R.R. Wilson and George and all, they brought all these god-awful sculptures and planted them all around the front of the of Hilbert Hall, and so they stayed there for about 2 or 3 years, and they were made out of plaster of Paris or something. They were starting to all crumble and everything. So one spring, I got a backhoe and I gathered up all of the sculptures, and I put them into a pile, and I brought in some dirt and covered them up and planted flowers on them.
Oh, so that's where the mound
That's the mound.
I didn't know that.
So we covered that up so the mound is all these old beat up sculptures.
So that's our time capsule.
Yes, that's our time capsule. So, but I guess that kind of covers it.